Welcome to Unlocking the Dream Vision. I'm your host, author R.J. von-Bruening. In this video series, we will be exploring the mysterious dream vision of Enoch, as explored in my book, Unlocking the Dream Vision, The Secret History of Creation. In this video, we will explore the Great Flood. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to hit the like button below and subscribe for future videos. This series presents information based upon theory and conjecture of the system of esoteric symbolism. The purpose is to suggest some possible interpretation, but not necessarily the only one to the many mysteries we will explore. The Great Flood, also commonly known as the legendary flood of Noah, could be the most famous, controversial, and debated stories of the entire biblical tradition. Not only is the Great Flood of Noah one of the best known stories of the entire Bible, it could also be one of the best known stories of humanity in general. There are almost 200 different versions of the flood stories in the world, with most of them being totally independent of the biblical story. It appears that almost every single ancient culture in the entire world that we know of have some unique version of this story. Although there are numerous different versions of the story, they all agree on a few key points that make it next to impossible to deny that they're not based on the same set of events. This viewpoint has been used by many people over the years to argue that this similarity between all the different versions of the flood story is the proof of some type of massive flooding that happened long ago, which naturally gave rise to the many different flood stories we have now. These few common points among these different ancient flood stories are that this terrible flood wiped out all of humanity except for one small group of people, typically one chosen family. The leader of this chosen group of people is warned by the gods or God himself that the oncoming destruction and is instructed to prepare for the death of all flesh. In this respect, there are two primary versions of the story. In one, a Noah-like figure builds a ship or ark, and the other, he leads his family or people to a very high place high above the flood waters, normally a mountain, to survive the destruction. The other key point is all the known versions of this ancient story agree that the Great Flood was planned, caused, and then ended by the gods or God himself. Additionally, the ancient flood stories remember that the primary reason this flood was for some great failing of humanity. As with the biblical tradition in general, it is believed that the flood was punishment for the great violence of sin that had raged across the earth. Although this is all very intriguing, it all still has the same problems of all the other ideas of the great flood stories, that there just doesn't appear to be any actual evidence to support a great worldwide flood as claimed in these ancient stories has occurred in millions of years, if ever. But there is ample evidence that massive local flooding events have occurred many times throughout the last few 100,000 years, normally occurring at the end of the great ice ages as the ice sheets melt and the waters begin being released. It has been proposed by numerous experts over the years that one or more of these ancient flooding events may have led to the many different versions of the Great Flood story that we have today, with the end of the last ice age at approximately 8,000 to 9,000 years ago as being one of the best candidates. But as we've been learning, the mystical symbolism of the dream vision has provided us with a much better understanding of the overall esoteric story. As we continue deeper into the story, we'll also begin filling in many of the different gaps that exist within the more traditional viewpoints of this flood story. The dream vision version of the Great Flood is incredibly similar to the biblical account, with even a few lines basically being word for word when it comes to the description of the actual flood. The primary difference between the two versions is that the dream vision provides additional details concerning the war and reconquest of Earth that ends with the Great Flood. This will also help begin filling in some of the gaps that we haven't covered in the last few videos. It also lends support to the idea that this great violence and sin that is remembered within the biblical tradition begins to destabilize this society of the fallen watchers. This would have also begun to weaken the political power and support of the rule of the Great Lord of Light. As the Great Lord of Light's political power began to loosen, it would have allowed his old defeated enemy the opportunity to launch new attacks to overthrow him and the other fallen watchers. This entire section of the war and reconquest of Earth, except for the violence and the flood itself, have been more or less removed from the biblical account and from the tradition in general. Again, the primary reason is because it portrays the Lord God of the Bible not as an all-powerful, all-knowing, loving, caring God that is promoted by the monotheistic religion. It instead presents us with a God that appears to have lost their power due to their cruel and brutal treatment of others. A God who is taking advantage of the troubles of others in order to regain his lost power. We return to the book of Enoch and the dream vision. And again, I saw how they began to gore each other and devour each other, and the earth began to cry aloud. And I raised my eyes again to heaven, and I saw in the vision, and behold, there came forth from heaven beings who were like white men, and 4 went forth from that place, and 3 with them. And those 3 that had last come forth grasped me by my hand and took me up away from the generations of the earth, and raised me up to a lofty place, and showed me a tower raised high above the earth, and all the hills were lower. And one said unto me, Remain here, thou seest everything that befalls those elephants, camels, and asses, and the stars, and the oxen, and all of them. Book of Enoch, chapter 87, verses 1 through 4. As with the biblical account, we are again told of the great violence that was occurring. But unlike the biblical account, we are told that these angels that were like white men came forth from the heaven. It is traditionally believed that these angels of God typically appear as beautiful human-like creatures with large wings on their backs, which is what one typically thinks of when they hear the word angel. But as we learned in the last video, this traditional viewpoint is more or less incorrect. These angels of God are not actually some type of human-like looking creature with wings on its back, but is in reality the ships that these gods use. This again might seem hard to believe, but once you are aware of what our ancestors were seeing, it will slowly begin to make sense. The most likely reason these angels of God appeared like white men is because of a unique phenomenon that we've all seen at some point in our lives. This phenomenon is the fact that at night, or in an incredibly dark environment, when you have a very intense light source like a spotlight or a floodlight, the typical high intensity street lights being a good example of this. This type of light source will normally create several bright spikes of light that radiate outward from the central light, especially if there is any particles floating in the air like dust, smoke, or even water vapor. If the light source is oval shape, it will typically create 4 spikes of light that will appear much like a cross. Normally it will create 1 spike of light pointing up with 2 slightly longer ones radiating out from the sides, with 1 final larger, brighter spike of light pointing straight down. This effect is amplified if your viewpoint is at an angle from below and as you look up at the bright light, much like you can see with a street light. If we combine this light phenomenon with a little bit of imagination, it's easy to imagine that it looks much like a great glowing human-shaped figure with wings of light hovering up in the sky, much like the stereotypical angel of the monotheistic religion traditions. This allows us to take the next step and realize that these angels that look like white men are brightly lit ships that are radiating out at least 4 great spikes of light, generating the illusion of a giant human-like figure hanging up in the sky. In the line of where Enoch speaks of being taken away from the generations of the earth and being raised up to a lofty place above a tower raised high above the earth, is not actually speaking of this particular event or time of the Great Flood, but is actually referring to an event that occurs much later in the story. At the moment, this might seem a little confusing and a little hard to understand, but we will be revisiting this part in great detail that will explain this. This is the first of a couple of different places within the dream vision where certain events of how they unfolded are slightly mixed up or just kind of plain out of place. As you will come to learn as we go farther into the dream vision, this is primarily due to the fact that there are really 2 separate and very different destructions that occurred in the past. The first one is remembered as the Great Destruction by Water, with the biblical flood of Noah being one of the most widely known. The second is the terrible destruction by fire, which is believed by a large majority of humanity to be an event that is to come some point in the near future. But as we continue our journey, you will come to learn that this terrifying prophecy of a fiery destruction from the sky at the end of time is not actually a prophecy at all, or even myth, but is something much, much more. All of this will begin to make a little bit more sense as we keep going deeper into the dream vision and the mystical symbolism. We have to return to the dream vision and the next set of verses where we will learn that the wrath of these 7 that came forth was unleashed upon the camels and asses and the stars and the oxen and all of them. And I saw one of those 4 who had come forth first, and he seized that first star which had fallen from heaven, and bound it hand and foot and cast it into the abyss. Now that abyss was narrow and deep and horrible and dark. And one of them drew a sword and gave it to those elephants and camels and asses, and they began to smite each other, and the whole world quaked because of them. And as I was beholding in the vision, lo, one of those 4 who had come forth stoned them from heaven, and gathered and took all the great stars, whose privy members, like those of horses, bound them all hand and foot, and cast them into the abyss of the earth. Book of Enoch, chapter 88, verses 1 through 3. As with Enoch being taken away from the generations of the earth, this description of the first star and all the great stars that followed him, being bound and cast into an abyss that was narrow and deep and horrible and dark, is not actually speaking of this particular event or punishment. It is actually speaking of an entirely different event that occurs at a much later point in the story. This is the second of the first few points that are mixed up within the dream vision. But again, we will revisit this in much greater detail when we get to that part of the story. Within the biblical tradition, it is at this point that Lucifer and his fellow fallen watchers are punished for their transgressions by being stripped of their divine power and cast out of heaven, forever exiled and cursed to walk the earth as devils, demons, and lost souls, forever trying to reclaim their power and their longing and their lust for their lost paradise. This is also the point in time where the great Lord of Light, the great benefactor of humanity, Lucifer, starts becoming the devil or Satan within the monotheistic traditions. Without their political power or access to their technology, the only thing the fallen watchers would have is their divine knowledge. Knowledge that they would use to try and recruit people for their cause to help undermine the support for the other side. This makes it rather easy to understand how the idea of temptation is one of the primary weapons of the fallen watchers, with them always tempting people with the divine knowledge of the gods in order to use them in an endless battle to reclaim their lost paradise and their political power. It is also traditionally believed that it is at this point in time that the fallen watchers had their physical appearance radically changed. A physical change that is traditionally believed to be related to stopping them from having the ability to mate or to produce offsprings with human, which, as we're told through the tradition, is what finally put an end to the chaos of the Nephilim and the giants. This is an event that is important to remember within the biblical tradition of the fallen watchers. We will revisit this at a later point, and it will also help provide a greater understanding of the controversial modern phenomenon and mysteries surrounding UFO abductions. As we are told, one of these angels drew a sword and gave it to the elephants, camels, and asses, and they began to smite each other. This provides us with the information that the flood was not just a singular event of punishment by God for mankind's corruption and sin as traditionally believed, but it tells us that there was an earlier period of warfare that was instigated by 4 of the 7 that came forth. This makes sense, since it would have been necessary to further weaken the Lord of Light's grip on power. We are then told that this civil war of the Nephilim and giants grew so violent that it thought that the whole world quaked because of them. As we will shortly see, this reference of the whole earth quaked will provide an important detail on dating this important event, and that is remembered as the Great Flood. And finally, we are told that one of these angels stoned them from heaven. This is also an important insight that is missing from all other known versions of the flood story, and that part of this reconquest involves some type of heavenly bombardment. When we combine this reference with that the whole world quake, that we can understand that it applies to a much greater conflict, which included a brutal civil war with some type of large-scale bombardment of the population in order to wipe them out or to force them out of an area. In order to understand this brutal destruction of the population, we need to remember that the original order of the gods and man was that of a slave society, which that means in order to reestablish this slave society, all ideas of freedom would need to be eliminated, because it does not bode well for any slave society if the slaves have any idea of freedom. So logically, they would need to wipe out or remove a large part of the population to destroy the information and knowledge of freedom. Again, it's very easy to understand why the monotheistic religions have removed this entire section from their holy books, because it clearly presents the Lord God of the monotheistic tradition as a horrible, brutal tyrant that's wiping out almost an entire civilization or people just so he could re-enslave them for a second time. This brings us to the actual event remembered as the Great Flood of Noah. And one of those four went to that white bull and instructed him in secret, without him being terrified. He was born a bull and became a man and built for himself a great vessel and dwelt thereon. And 3 bulls dwelt with him in that vessel, and they were covered in. And again I raised my eyes toward the heaven, and I saw a lofty roof with 7 water torrents thereon. And those torrents flowed with much water into an enclosure. And I saw again, and beheld fountains were opened on the surface of that great enclosure, and the water began to swell and rise upon the surface. And I saw that enclosure till all its surface was covered with water, and the water, the darkness, and the mist increased upon it, as I looked at the height of that water. That water had risen above the height of that enclosure and was streaming over that enclosure, and it stood upon the earth. And all the cattle of that enclosure were gathered together until I saw how they sank and were swallowed up and perished in that water. But that vessel floated on the water, while all the oxen and elephants and camels and asses sank to the bottom with all the animals, so that I could no longer see them, and they were not able to escape, but perished and sank into the depths. Book of Enoch, chapter 89, verses 1 through 6. This version is very similar to the biblical account. It also contains additional information that helps provide a much greater understanding of the entire Noah story and his great ark. As with the biblical story, the Noah figure is approached by an angel that instructs him to build a great vessel, an ark. As with the biblical story, we are told that 3 bulls dwelt within it. These are remembered as the 3 sons of Noah in the biblical story. This brings us to possibly the single most debated and controversial parts of the entire biblical tradition for believer and skeptic alike, the animals of the ark. As you are no doubt aware, this could very well be the single most debated subject in the entire Bible. But now, with our new understanding of the mystical symbolism of the dream vision, we can finally and very easily answer this question once and for all. This is because we have already been presented with the answer to this age-old question right at the beginning of our journey into the symbolic dream vision of Enoch, that animals symbolically represent people or groups of people. With this understanding, this timeless controversy with all its mystery just simply melts away. It also makes the biblical story take on a whole new meaning, with it entering into the realm of possibility. This is one of the best examples of how effective this mystical animal symbolism is for concealing hidden or esoteric knowledge within the literal story. Because if you do not understand its true meaning, you won't understand the larger story behind it. It also allows us to finally understand the symbolism of the animals in the verses of Genesis chapter 7, verses 2 through 3, where God instructed Noah on which type of animals he was to take upon the ark. Can understand this in a way that just removes all of the mystery. Of every clean beast thou shalt take to thee by 7s, the male and his female, and of beasts that are not clean by 2, the male and his female. Of fowls also of the air by 7s, the male and his female. Keep seed alive upon the face of all the earth. Genesis chapter 7, verses 2 through 3. We can now understand that these divine instructions from God are not telling Noah to take 2 of each type of animal onto the ark, as traditionally believed, but it is instructing Noah to take 7 males and 7 females of each group of people that are represented by an animal totem or symbol. These are the ones that are clean or righteous, that stayed faithful to the Lord God. They are like Noah in the sense that they were perfect in their generations and they had not mated or been corrupted by the sons of God or any of their unholy offspring. Noah was then instructed to only take 1 male and 1 female of the people that had been corrupted by the Lord of Light and the other fallen watchers. These are the unclean ones. These unclean ones had either mated with the sons of God or were descended from their bastard offspring. Once you understand the mystical symbolic meaning of the animals and that they actually represent people or groups of people, we can quickly realize that the dimensions given in the Bible for the size of the ark allows us to estimate how many individuals could have actually been on a boat of this size. Using modern measurements, the biblical story describes a ship that's 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and approximately 45 feet high, that was broken into at least 3 primary decks. If we account for the necessary support structures and other engineering factors due to the wood construction of this ark, we end up with approximately 75,000 to 85,000 square feet of possible living space, which is more than enough space for approximately 2,500 to 3,000 individuals with enough supplies to last at least 150 days without much trouble. Now this is where it starts to get interesting, because this is where we begin to leave the world of myth, legend, folklore, and faith behind and begin moving into the real world. This is also where we will begin to take our next step towards learning the true meaning of the mystical symbolism and the secrets of creation that it truly holds. This is because if we take this knowledge, that it was really people and not animals that were taken upon the ark and return to modern science, we will discover that there is a surprisingly similar natural event long ago that almost wiped out all of humanity. Not only do we find an extinction level event that appears to fit the flood, but it also has a very similar estimate of survivors that matches very closely to the one we just explored. Scientific evidence tells us that approximately 74,000 years ago, give or take a couple of thousand years, humanity genetically bottlenecked and came very close to extinction. It's thought that this event is the closest our species has ever come to total extinction. It has also been proposed that this almost extinction event of humanity is connected to the Toba super volcano eruption that is thought to have occurred at roughly the same time. It has also been proposed that this massive eruption may have been one of the primary reasons in starting the last ice age, or at least being a major factor in making the conditions worse than earlier ice ages, both of which would have added to the reduction of the chances of survival for our ancestors. This allows us to begin to realize that the effects of the eruption of a supervolcano could be where the idea of the angels stoning people from heaven comes from within the dream vision. This super eruption would have been powerful enough to eject rock to the very edge of space. It is easy to imagine as this ejected rock fell back to earth, it would be interpreted by our ancient ancestors as one of the angels stoning them from heaven. This also implies that the Toba supervolcano eruption may not have been a fully natural event, but it could have been caused by the gods in their war to reclaim power. It's also possible that the eruption happened naturally and the gods were just taking advantage of the situation by claiming that it was of their own doing. This brings us to the next and final phase of the great reconquest of earth, the flood. Unlike the Bible, the dream vision tells us that Enoch saw a lofty roof of a great enclosure where 7 water torrents were open, and out of these flowed with much water into that enclosure. We are also told that he beheld as fountains were opened on the surface of that great enclosure, that it began to fill with vast volumes of water. This is one of the most astounding and enlightening lines of the entire dream vision, because it provides us with the missing pieces of information about the great flood of Noah. That it was not an unbelievable event of a worldwide flood that wiped out of all humanity, but it was in fact a very large enclosure where most of the early human population was at the time when it was flooded. This, of course, raises the question of where this mighty enclosure was. In our next video, we will explore this question of where this enclosure was located. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button below and subscribe for future videos.